I used to believe that love meant security, that marriage was a fortress built by two people who promised to protect each other from the world. 12 years of marriage to James had taught me that. Or at least, that's what I thought. Where are you watching from today? Comment down below. My name is Emma, and I'm a financial advisor. I help people protect their assets, plan for their futures, and build security. The irony isn't lost on me now. I spent my days safeguarding other people's finances while my own husband was secretly dismantling everything we'd built together. James and I met in college. He was studying business with dreams of breaking into real estate, and I was pursuing my finance degree. We were the power couple everyone envied, ambitious, driven, and completely in sync. After graduation, we both landed great jobs. I joined a financial advisory firm while James started working for a real estate developer. We waited a few years to get married, building our careers and saving for our dream home. By our 5th anniversary, we had purchased a beautiful colonial-style house in a neighborhood we once couldn't afford to drive through. By our 10th, we had substantial savings and investments. We were living the dream, or so I thought. The first sign something was wrong came on a Tuesday evening. James called to say he'd be working late again, the 3rd time that week. Real estate was booming, and he was handling multiple commercial property acquisitions. At least, that's what he told me. I didn't think twice about it then. Why would I? We trusted each other completely. But then came the small changes. James started keeping his phone face down. He began taking calls in another room, his voice lowered to a whisper. When I'd walk in, he'd quickly end the conversation, or switch to discussing work. The password on his phone changed from my birthday to something I didn't know. Just being more security conscious, he said when I asked about it. Some of the guys at work had their accounts hacked. I wanted to believe him, so I did. Then came the credit card statement with charges I couldn't explain. A $400 dinner at Vincenzo's, an upscale Italian restaurant downtown that we'd been saving for our anniversary. When I mentioned it, James said it was a business dinner with clients. You know how it is, Em. Sometimes you have to spend money to make money. There was also a charge from Ellington Jewelers for over $2,000. When I asked about it, James seemed momentarily flustered before recovering. I felt terrible for spoiling his surprise and didn't bring it up again. Our anniversary came and went 3 weeks later. There was no jewelry. When I gently asked about it, James claimed he was waiting for a special order that had been delayed. I nodded and smiled, but something inside me cracked. The next day, I did something I never thought I would do. While James was in the shower, I checked his phone. The security pattern was easy to guess. It was the same one he used for everything, just starting from a different corner. What I found shattered my world in an instant. There were hundreds of text messages between James and someone named Vanessa. The conversations were intimate, passionate, and had been going on for over a year. There were declarations of love, explicit messages, and, most painfully, complaints about me. Emma's so predictable. One message from James read, "Always talking about savings and investments. With you, I feel alive." I sat on our bed, phone in hand, unable to move as I heard the shower turn off. James walked into our bedroom with a towel around his waist, humming. He stopped cold when he saw his phone in my hand and the expression on my face. "What are you doing with my phone?" His voice was quiet, dangerous. "Who is Vanessa?" I asked, surprised by how steady my voice sounded when everything inside me was collapsing. "A colleague," he said quickly. "We work together on the West Side development." "Do you always tell your colleagues that you love them? That you can't wait to taste them again?" His face drained of color. "Emma, it's not what you think." "Really? Because I think you're having an affair. I think you've been lying to me for at least a year. I think that dinner at Vincenzo's wasn't with clients. And I'm guessing that jewelry wasn't for me either. It didn't mean anything, he insisted. It was just physical. A stupid mistake. A year-long mistake? With romantic dinners and jewelry gifts? I was going to end it, he said, sitting beside me on the bed. I moved away. Emma, please. You're my wife. I love you. This thing with Vanessa, it was just an escape. It wasn't real. I felt numb as I scrolled through more messages. Plans they'd made. Places they'd gone together. Inside jokes they shared. If it wasn't real, why did you tell her you loved her yesterday? I asked. James hung his head. I don't know. I got caught up in it all. But I'll end it today, I promise. We can go to counseling. We can fix this. Does she know you're married? I asked. James hesitated, which was answer enough. Of course she does, he finally admitted. But I told her we were having problems. Were we? Having problems, I mean? He looked confused by the question. Well, you're always so focused on work, on saving for the future. Sometimes I just wanted to live in the moment. I almost laughed. My dedication to our financial security was now being twisted into a justification for his betrayal. We talked, or rather, James talked, for hours that night. He promised to break things off with Vanessa immediately. He agreed to marriage counseling. He begged for another chance. In the end, exhausted and shattered, I said we could try. The next day, James made a show of calling Vanessa on speakerphone while I was present, telling her it was over. She cried. He remained firm. After hanging up, he held me and promised again that he was committed to rebuilding our marriage. We attended one counseling session that week. James spoke eloquently about his regrets, his commitment to our marriage, his desire to make amends. The therapist seemed impressed with his insight and remorse. I sat quietly, watching my husband's performance with new eyes. Because that's what it was. A performance. Even as he held my hand in the therapist's office, even as he brought me flowers and prepared dinner that week, I noticed things. The way he still took his phone everywhere, even to the bathroom. How he seemed distracted, checking his watch during our reconnection date night. The way he suggested we focus on emotional healing before diving back into financial discussions. That last one should have been my biggest red flag. But sometimes, even when you're staring directly at a flag the size of a billboard, painted bright red and waving frantically in the wind, you can choose not to see it. Because seeing it would mean acknowledging that the life you believed in was built on sand, and the tide was already coming in. Have you ever felt that moment when trust shatters? It doesn't break cleanly. It splinters, leaving sharp edges everywhere that cut you each time you try to pick up the pieces. I was about to discover that James's betrayal went far deeper than I could have imagined, and that this was just the beginning of my story. 2 weeks after discovering James's affair, he suggested something that should have immediately set off alarms. I think we should take a break from checking our finances, he said one evening as we sat on opposite ends of the couch. Just for a while. All these spreadsheets and investment reviews, they're keeping us stuck in the same patterns. Maybe we should focus on emotional healing first. I nodded, wanting to believe this was a genuine attempt to prioritize our relationship, but something in his eyes didn't match his words. There was a calculation there that made me uneasy. Whatever you think will help, I said, watching his shoulders relax. As a financial advisor, I spend my days analyzing numbers, spotting patterns, and identifying anomalies. It's second nature to me. So when James suggested we stop monitoring our finances, a part of my brain, the professional part, immediately went on high alert. That night, after James fell asleep, I sat in our home office with my laptop. I told myself I was just being paranoid, that grief and betrayal were making me suspicious, but I needed to check. I logged into our joint savings account. The balance was much lower than it should have been. Much, much lower. I felt physically ill, my hands shaking as I checked our other accounts. Our investment portfolio had several significant withdrawals as well, all initiated by James over the last 4 months. When I looked at the transaction records, the withdrawals were spaced out strategically. Never too much at once, but a steady draining of our financial resources. The same methodical approach James used in his business deals had been applied to systematically steal from our future. I didn't confront him immediately. The financial advisor in me took over. I needed to understand exactly what had happened before I made my next move. The following day, I called in sick to work for the first time in years. As soon as James left for the office, I began my investigation. I traced the withdrawals, following the money trail. James had transferred most of it to his personal account, then made a series of large payments to a title company. It took me 3 hours of digging, using every professional resource at my disposal, but I finally found it. A property purchase in Oakwood Heights, an upscale neighborhood across town. The deed was in James's name only, dated just 2 weeks earlier. The purchase price, $341,000. I sat back in my chair, trying to process what this meant. While promising to work on our marriage, while holding my hand in therapy and apologizing for his affair, James had been buying a house with our savings. Our future was being traded for his new life with Vanessa. I drove to the address that afternoon. It was a beautiful craftsman-style house with a wide front porch and a newly planted maple tree in the yard. The kind of house we had always talked about owning someday. A moving truck was parked in the driveway, and there, directing movers where to place a leather sectional sofa, was my husband. Standing beside him, pointing and laughing, was a young woman I immediately knew was Vanessa. She was probably in her mid-20s, with long dark hair and the confident posture of someone who had never had anything taken from her. I parked across the street and watched them for nearly 20 minutes. They moved around each other with the easy familiarity of people who had spent a lot of time together. At one point, James wrapped his arm around her waist and kissed her temple. The casual intimacy of it felt like a physical blow. Finally, I got out of my car and walked across the street. James didn't notice me until I was halfway up the driveway. When he did, his face went through a rapid series of expressions: shock, guilt, anger, and finally, a strange calm. "Emma," he said, his voice steady. "I can explain." "Explain what?" I asked, surprised by how calm I sounded. "How you stole $350,000 from our savings to buy a house with your girlfriend, while pretending to work on our marriage?" Vanessa looked between us, her expression shifting from confusion to realization. "You said you were separated," she said to James, taking a step back. "We are. Emotionally, we are," James replied, never taking his eyes off me. "Emma, I was going to tell you. After we were settled." "Settled?" I repeated. "You mean after you'd finished stealing from me?" "It's not stealing," he said, his voice hardening. "Half of that money is mine." "And the other half? The half that I earned and saved? What would you call taking that?" "I deserve happiness," he said simply, as if that explained everything. "After 12 years of living by your rules, your budgets, your 5-year plans, I deserve to live the life I want." I looked at Vanessa, who was edging toward the front door, clearly uncomfortable with the scene unfolding. "Did you know he was using our savings to buy this house?" I asked her. She shook her head quickly. "He said he had his own money. From his business." "Of course he did," I said, "because James is an expert at telling people exactly what they want to hear." James stepped between us. "That's enough, Emma. This isn't Vanessa's fault." No, it's yours, I agreed. But I'm curious. What was your plan here? You've been systematically draining our accounts for months. When were you going to tell me our future was gone? I thought we could handle this like adults, he said. Get a clean divorce. Split the remaining assets. You'd be fine. You're good with money. And you make great money at the firm. You'll recover. The casual way he discussed erasing our financial security, the future we had planned together, left me breathless. This wasn't just betrayal. It was erasure. As if our 12 years together were a business arrangement he could simply terminate when a better opportunity came along. How long have you been planning this? I asked. Does it matter? He countered. It matters to me. He sighed, running a hand through his hair. About 6 months. But the affair has been going on longer. I didn't think it would become this serious. 6 months of calculated financial decisions. 6 months of lies. 6 months of looking me in the eye every day while systematically dismantling our life together. You should go, James said, glancing at the movers who were awkwardly trying to pretend they weren't witnessing this painful scene. We can talk about this later, when we're both calmer. I laughed then, a hollow sound that seemed to echo in the suburban quiet of the street. Calmer? You think I'm going to be calmer about this tomorrow? Or the next day? You'll get over it, he said with a certainty that stunned me. You're practical. You'll see that this is for the best. We weren't happy, Emma. No, I said quietly. You weren't happy. But instead of having the courage to tell me that, you decided to steal from me and lie to me. And now you expect me to just get over it. I turned to leave, then paused and looked back at him. Enjoy your new house, James. I hope it was worth it. As I walked back to my car, I could feel his eyes on me. I didn't cry. I didn't scream. A strange calm had settled over me, the kind that comes when shock gives way to clarity. In that moment, I knew our marriage was over, but I also knew that this betrayal would not define the rest of my life. James had just made the biggest mistake of his life, and unlike him, I was not going to underestimate my opponent. I didn't go home that night. I couldn't bear to sleep in the same house, the same bed, knowing what James had done. Instead, I checked into a hotel downtown and made 3 phone calls. The first was to Diane Reynolds, the most ruthless divorce attorney in the city. I'd met her at a charity event last year and remembered thinking she was intimidating. Exactly what I needed now. I can see you tomorrow at 7 a.m., she said after I explained my situation. Bring all financial records you can access. And Emma, don't tell your husband you're meeting with me. The second call was to my boss, explaining I needed a few personal days. The third was to my friend Megan, who immediately offered her guest room for as long as I needed it. I barely slept that night. Every time I closed my eyes, I saw James and Vanessa in that house. My house, bought with my money. By morning, shock had hardened into resolve. Diane's office was in a sleek high-rise with a view of the river. She listened without interruption as I detailed James's affair and financial deception. Unfortunately, this isn't uncommon, she said when I finished. But the good news? He made some critical mistakes. Using joint funds to purchase property in his name only during a marriage? That's going to be problematic for him. She tapped her pen against her legal pad. Here's what we're going to do today. First, we're freezing your joint accounts immediately. Second, we're documenting everything. Every withdrawal, every transfer. Third, I'm filing for an emergency hearing to prevent further dissipation of marital assets. I nodded, feeling a strange sense of clarity. What about the house he bought? That's marital property, purchased with marital funds. The court won't look kindly on his actions. She leaned forward. Emma, I need to ask. Is there anything else he might be hiding? Any business dealings that seem suspicious? I thought for a moment. He's been talking about a new development project, but being unusually secretive about it. Said it was a special deal with limited investors. Diane made a note. We'll look into that. Now, go to a different bank, not where you have joint accounts, and open new accounts in your name only. Move your next paycheck there. Don't move any existing funds yet. We'll handle that through legal channels. By noon, I had new bank accounts, a folder of legal documents, and preliminary divorce papers drawn up. I felt like I was moving underwater. Everything was slow, dreamlike, but I kept moving forward. When I returned to our house that evening to pack some clothes, James was waiting. He looked haggard, his usual polished appearance disheveled. "Where were you last night?" he demanded. I was worried. "Were you?" I asked, walking past him toward our bedroom. "That's surprising, considering you've been planning your exit for months." He followed me. "Emma, we need to talk about this rationally. Yes, I made a mistake with the house, but—" "A mistake?" I turned to face him. "A mistake is forgetting an anniversary or burning dinner. You systematically drained our savings to buy a house for you and your girlfriend while lying to my face every day. That's not a mistake, James. That's who you are." I pulled a suitcase from the closet and began filling it with clothes. "What are you doing?" His voice had an edge of panic now. "What does it look like? I'm leaving." "You can't just leave. We need to discuss dividing our assets, the house." "Oh, we will," I said, continuing to pack. "My attorney will be in touch." "Attorney?" His face flushed. "You already got a lawyer?" "Jesus, Emma, it's been 1 day." "And you've had 6 months of planning. I'm just catching up." I zipped the suitcase closed. "By the way, the joint accounts are frozen. You won't be taking any more of our money." His expression shifted from shock to anger. "You had no right to do that." "Actually, I had every right. Just like you had the right to withdraw $350,000 without discussing it with me?" I picked up my suitcase. Interesting how rights only matter when they're yours. As I headed for the door, James grabbed my arm. "You can't do this to me. I need that money for closing costs, for furniture." I looked pointedly at his hand until he released me. "You should have thought of that before you spent our savings on your girlfriend's dream house." What happened next would later be described by my attorney as a significant tactical error on James's part. He lost control. The carefully maintained facade of the successful, charming businessman cracked completely. "You frigid bitch," he hissed. "You think anyone will believe you? I'm respected in this community. You're just a number-crunching nobody who couldn't keep her husband interested." I felt oddly calm as I took out my phone, opened the voice memo app, and held it up. "Say that again?" I don't think my attorney quite caught it. The blood drained from his face. I hadn't actually been recording, but his reaction told me everything I needed to know about his character and how he would behave during our divorce. "This isn't over," he said as I walked out the door. He was right about that, at least. The next 3 weeks were a blur of legal meetings, financial forensics, and emotional numbness. I moved into Megan's guest room and threw myself into building my case with Diane. We discovered James had been doing more than just draining our personal accounts. He'd been siphoning money from his business partnerships too, using creative accounting to hide significant sums. I wasn't the only one he'd betrayed. Then came the market crash. It started with a major developer declaring bankruptcy, sending shockwaves through the local real estate market. Properties that had been worth millions suddenly lost 30% of their value overnight. Development projects were frozen. Investors panicked, including James's business partners, who decided to take a closer look at their books. I was in Diane's office when I got the call from Thomas Reeves, James's longest business partner and oldest friend. "Did you know?" he asked without preamble. "About the money he was taking from the company?" I just found out he was stealing from me too, I replied. How bad is it? Almost $200,000, Thomas said, his voice tight with anger. We're filing charges. That same day, we learned that the special development project James had been so secretive about didn't exist. It was a shell created to funnel money from his legitimate business to his personal accounts. The house he'd bought for Vanessa was now worth significantly less than he'd paid for it, and with the market in freefall, he couldn't sell it to recoup his investment. Or rather, my investment. By the end of the month, James's business partners had filed lawsuits, freezing his professional assets. The new house, the symbol of his betrayal, was at risk of foreclosure before he'd even finished moving in. I watched it all unfold with a detachment that surprised me. There was no satisfaction in his downfall, only a grim acknowledgement that actions have consequences. Then came the day I drove past the house, I couldn't help myself, and saw Vanessa loading suitcases into her car. James was on the porch, gesturing angrily as she slammed the trunk closed. I slowed down just enough to see her throw something at him before driving away. Later, I learned from mutual acquaintances that Vanessa had left him when the money started drying up. Apparently, she'd been seeing someone else too. A backup plan James knew nothing about. The jewelry he'd bought her had already been sold. Karma, it seemed, worked efficiently. Through it all, I focused on rebuilding. I worked with my attorney to document every financial transaction, every lie, every betrayal. I moved from Megan's guest room to a small apartment of my own. I returned to work, channeling my pain into productivity. And as James's world collapsed around him, I realized I was already building something new from the ashes of what he'd destroyed. Something that was entirely mine, that no one could take from me again. For the first time since discovering his betrayal, I felt something close to peace. Not because he was suffering, I was beyond caring about that, but because I was surviving. More than surviving. I was finding strength I never knew I had. In destroying our marriage, James had inadvertently set me free. 3 months after I walked out of our home, I received the first desperate text from James. By then, the full extent of his financial collapse had become brutally apparent. The bank is foreclosing on the house, his message read. Vanessa left. She took everything she could carry, including the Rolex my father gave me. Can we talk? Please? I didn't respond. There was nothing to say. A week later, another text. I know I messed up. I was stupid and selfish, but I need your help. My partners are pressing charges. I could go to jail, Emma. Again, I didn't respond. His problems weren't my problems anymore. The third text came at 2 a.m., waking me from a rare night of uninterrupted sleep. I'm living in my car. Everything's gone. I still love you. I made a terrible mistake. Please help me. This time I blocked his number. During those same months, I had been methodically rebuilding my life. The divorce proceedings were moving forward smoothly, largely because James had no leverage. His financial deception was thoroughly documented. His business assets were frozen. His reputation was in tatters. Even his attorney advised him to settle. Diane called one afternoon with the news. "And the spousal support?" I asked. He tried to fight it, but given the circumstances, particularly the evidence of financial misconduct, the judge wasn't sympathetic. You'll receive the full amount we requested for 3 years. I felt a strange emptiness at the news. Victory, I was discovering, didn't feel how I expected. There was no joy, no sense of triumph, just relief that this chapter was ending. How soon will the divorce be final? I asked. 60 days, Diane replied. Faster than most. The judge wasn't impressed with James's actions. I thanked her and ended the call, staring out the window of my new apartment. It was smaller than our old house, in a different neighborhood, but it was mine. Every decision about it, from the location to the color of the kitchen cabinets, had been mine alone. There was power in that I'd never fully appreciated before. As the divorce neared its conclusion, I focused on my career with renewed intensity. I took on more clients, developed a specialized service for women going through major life transitions, and started teaching a financial literacy workshop at the community center. Helping other women understand and control their finances became more than a job. It was a mission. Then came the day I least expected. I was leaving the office when a homeless man approached me in the parking garage. It took me several seconds to recognize him. James. His appearance was shocking. Gone was the polished businessman in tailored suits. His face was gaunt, his clothes disheveled, his eyes hollow. He had the desperate look of someone who had lost everything. "Emma," he said, his voice hoarse. "Please, just 5 minutes." I should have walked away. I should have called security. But something, curiosity perhaps, or the fading echoes of 12 years together, made me stop. 5 minutes, I said, keeping my distance. "I've lost everything," he said, gesturing helplessly at himself. "The house is gone. My partnership is dissolved. My reputation is destroyed. I'm facing potential jail time for financial fraud." "Those are consequences, James, not coincidences." He nodded, a quick, jerky movement. I know that now. I don't know what I was thinking. That I deserved more. That I could have everything without consequences. "Where's Vanessa?" I asked, though I already knew the answer. "Gone. Left me when the money ran out. Turns out she had another guy lined up, some tech executive. She was planning her exit strategy the whole time." He gave a hollow laugh. "Sound familiar?" I didn't rise to the bait. "Your 5 minutes are almost up. What do you want, James?" "I need help," he said, his voice breaking. "A place to stay. Some money to get back on my feet. I've learned my lesson, Emma. I really have. And despite everything, I still love you." The words that once would have melted my heart now rang hollow. I looked at him, really looked at him, and felt nothing but a distant pity. "No," I said simply. His face hardened. "No? Just like that? 12 years of marriage and you're just going to watch me suffer? 12 years of marriage and you stole my savings to buy a house for your mistress," I reminded him. "You're not suffering because of me, James. You're suffering because of you." He stepped closer, desperation making him reckless. "I made a mistake. People make mistakes. You're really going to throw away everything we had over one mistake?" "It wasn't one mistake," I said calmly. "It was hundreds of calculated decisions over months. You decided to have an affair. You decided to lie to me. You decided to steal from me. You decided to steal from your partners. You made those choices day after day, knowing exactly what you were doing." "I wasn't thinking clearly." "You were thinking perfectly clearly," I cut him off. "You just never thought you'd face consequences." "That's not the same thing." I met his gaze steadily. "We're getting divorced in 3 weeks, James. Your problems aren't my problems anymore." "You cold-hearted bitch," he snarled, his charming facade crumbling completely. "You think you're so much better than me? You think you've won? I'll find a way back. I always do. And when I do—" "When you do what?" I asked, taking out my phone. "Threaten me. Is that really your plan right now?" He seemed to remember suddenly where he was, in a parking garage with security cameras, threatening his soon-to-be ex-wife who happened to be recording the conversation. The fight drained out of him, replaced by defeat. "I have nothing left," he said quietly. "You built this reality," I told him, walking toward my car. "Now you get to live in it." As I drove away, I caught a glimpse of him in my rearview mirror, a solitary figure standing in the empty parking garage, diminished and alone. The man who had once been the center of my world was now a stranger to me. I expected to feel something, satisfaction, vindication, even guilt. Instead, I felt only certainty. The cord that had bound us was finally cut. I was free. The divorce was finalized on a Tuesday morning. I signed the papers in Diane's office, the scratching of my pen against paper oddly final. When I handed them back to her, she smiled. "Congratulations," she said. "It's officially over." I nodded, waiting for the rush of emotion that should accompany such a moment. It didn't come. "How do you feel?" Diane asked, noticing my silence. I considered the question carefully. "Like I'm finally facing the right direction," I said, "and ready to start walking." As I left her office, stepping into the bright spring sunshine, I realized it was true. The past was behind me now. The future, whatever it might hold, was entirely mine. And for the first time in a very long time, that thought filled me with something like hope. 6 months after my divorce was finalized, I stood in the reception area of my new office. The sign on the door read Emma Mitchell Financial Consulting, and though it was small, just a 2-room office suite in a mid-tier building downtown, it was entirely mine. Using my portion of the divorce settlement, I had taken the leap and started my own firm. My years at the financial advisory company had given me connections, expertise, and a solid client base, many of whom followed me when I struck out on my own. But I wanted to do something more targeted, more meaningful. I specialized in helping women secure their financial independence, particularly those going through divorce or major life transitions. The tagline on my business cards read, "Your money, your future, your terms." Words I had come to live by. My assistant, Leah, poked her head in from the front room. "Your 2 o'clock is here. First-time client." I nodded, straightening the papers on my desk. These initial consultations were always a mix of financial planning and emotional support. Women often came to me at their most vulnerable, frightened about their financial futures after relationships ended. I knew that feeling intimately. The woman who walked in looked like I had felt a year ago, exhausted, anxious, but with a determined set to her jaw. She was perhaps mid-30s, clutching a folder of documents so tightly her knuckles were white. "I'm Rebecca," she said, taking the seat across from me. "My friend Megan referred me. She said you helped her sister last year." I smiled, remembering the case. "I'm glad to meet you, Rebecca. Why don't you tell me what brings you here today?" "I'm getting divorced," she said, her voice catching slightly. "My husband, he's been controlling our finances completely. I don't even know what we have or don't have. He says I'll get nothing if I leave him, that I'll be destitute." The familiar story sent a pang through me. Financial manipulation. Another form of control. Another way to keep someone trapped. "He's wrong," I said firmly, "and I'm going to help you prove it." For the next hour, we went through her situation. Her husband had systematically kept her in the dark about their finances for their entire 10-year marriage. Classic financial abuse, limiting access to accounts, forcing her to ask for money, creating an allowance system as if she were a child. She'd worked before marriage but had stayed home with their children for the past 8 years, making her feel especially vulnerable. "I'm afraid," she admitted. "I have no recent work experience, 2 young children to support. And Jack says the prenup means I get nothing." "First," I said, "we need to see that prenuptial agreement. Often they're not as airtight as people think, especially if they involve clearly unfair terms. Second, we're going to do a full financial discovery. Every account, every asset, every debt. Your attorney can request these officially, but there are also ways you can legally gather information. I outlined a strategy, watching her shoulders straighten incrementally as we talked. By the end of our session, she had a clear list of next steps and something she hadn't had when she walked in. Hope. Thank you, she said as she was leaving. Megan said you'd understand because you've been there. She was right. I smiled. Sometimes the most painful experiences give us the most valuable perspective. After she left, I sat quietly at my desk, reflecting on how far I'd come since that devastating day I discovered James's betrayal. The pain hadn't disappeared entirely. Sometimes it still ambushed me in quiet moments, but it had transformed into something constructive, even powerful. That weekend, I closed on my dream home, a modern 2-bedroom condo overlooking the river. It was the kind of place James had always dismissed as impractical and overpriced. Now, using my portion of the divorce settlement and my growing business income, I had bought it outright. No mortgage, no debt, no one else's name on the deed. My friend Megan helped me move in, christening the new place with champagne on the balcony as the sun set over the river. To new beginnings, she toasted, clinking her glass against mine. And to hard-won wisdom, I added. Later that evening, after Megan left, I stood in my new living room, taking in the space that was completely, undeniably mine. The furniture I had chosen, the art I loved, the future I was building. There was a profound satisfaction in this ownership that went beyond the material. 3 weeks after moving in, I was grocery shopping when I saw him. James was working behind the counter at the gas station attached to the supermarket. Our eyes met as I walked past, and for a moment, neither of us moved. The transformation was still shocking, the once successful businessman now in a polyester uniform, his face gaunt and tired. He came out from behind the counter. Emma. James, I acknowledged with a nod, preparing to keep walking. Wait, he said. Please. Against my better judgment, I paused. What is it? I heard you started your own firm and bought a place on Riverside Drive. His voice was a strange mix of bitterness and admiration. Looks like you landed on your feet. I worked for it, I replied simply. He glanced down at his uniform, a flush of shame crossing his face. Meanwhile, this is all I could get. Nobody in real estate will touch me. My reputation is shot. I didn't respond, unsure what he expected from me. Sympathy? Satisfaction? Neither seemed appropriate. You could have helped me, he said, a familiar note of accusation creeping into his voice. After everything we shared, 12 years of marriage, you just walked away and left me with nothing. The old guilt tactics. Once they might have worked. Now, they just seemed transparent. You took everything we shared and spent it on another woman, I reminded him. You made your choices, James. I made mine. He looked at me with a mixture of anger and desperation. So that's it? You've moved on completely? Built this perfect new life while I'm barely surviving? For a moment, I considered walking away without answering, but something made me stop. Not guilt or obligation, but a need for final clarity. I built a new life, I said, because you destroyed our old one. I didn't do this to you, James. You did this to yourself. And yes, I've moved on. I suggest you do the same. As I walked away, I realized I felt nothing but a distant pity for him. The power he once held over me, the power to hurt me, to make me doubt myself, was completely gone. Outside, loading groceries into my car, I was surprised to find I was smiling. Not at James's downfall, but at my own resilience, at the woman I had become through fire. The following week, I expanded my practice, hiring a junior advisor to help with the growing client list. I also launched a free monthly workshop at the women's shelter downtown, teaching basic financial literacy to women escaping abusive relationships. Standing before my first workshop group, looking at the faces of women who had lost so much but were fighting to rebuild, I felt a profound connection. We were all survivors, in different ways. Financial independence isn't just about money, I told them as we concluded the session. It's about reclaiming your power. It's about creating a life that belongs to you and no one else. One woman raised her hand. How do you start over when you've lost everything? I thought about that moment in the hotel room the night I discovered James's betrayal, the feeling of the world collapsing around me, and then the slow, determined rebuilding that followed. You start, I said, by recognizing that you haven't lost everything. You still have yourself, your intelligence, your strength, your future. Those are the things no one can take from you unless you let them. As I drove home that evening to my riverside condo, watching the sunset paint the water gold, I realized I was genuinely happy. Not despite what I had been through, but in some ways because of it. The betrayal that had nearly destroyed me had ultimately set me free. Some lessons come at an unbearable cost, but if they lead you to a better place, perhaps they're worth the price after all.